Hi, everyone. After all those little blurbs and thought pieces, we're ready to start, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Nishan Dimel. I'm from Verity Research, and we are really happy to be launching today a report for the second time that has long time been in the baking on measuring proactive disclosure in Sri Lanka. I think our starting point for doing stuff on right to information is we think that the foundational to democracy is the fact that we not only say democracy is government by the people, for the people, of the people. What does that mean? It means that people understand what government is doing if it is being done on their behalf. You can't have a government that represents you, I think, and not be willing to share the information minimally of what it is doing on your behalf and for the country and for the future of the country. I think we take that as basic and obvious. So when we passed the Right to Information Bill, that was 20 years in the baking also. We first started talking about it in the early 2000s and finally passed it after 2015. One of the really important developments was, of course, that it started changing people's mindset and culture. We didn't look at government ministries and officers the way we did at our colonial masters, as those who own the information for which we must beg and plead and say, please, sir, can I have a little more information? But we saw them as having an obligation, and we started to see them having an obligation to share the information because it was information that people were entitled to have. Of course, for many of you who've done that for quite a while, you have seen that it can become quite time-consuming, quite difficult, and it's not easy. There are lots of letters back and forth, requests, and then appeals. And the RTI Commission back in the day passed regulations under this bill that were quite important. And one of those regulations was about proactive disclosure, that instead of reactive disclosure, so you don't have to wait till people ask you and then send them the information. You are obliged, and it makes a lot of sense and saves an enormous amount of human effort and time and trouble, to actually share the information proactively, and it classified the kinds of information that should be proactively shared online. So what Verity did, I forgot, maybe 5 years ago for the first time, was actually come up with a careful methodology to measure and evaluate the extent to which proactive disclosure was complied with in Sri Lankan government, different public authorities that were supposed to comply. That methodology turned out to be so interesting or valued that the World Bank took it and started using it in many other countries as well. And so there are several countries now that are doing proactive disclosure reports using the methodology we developed with a lot of, literally blood, sweat, and tears at that time. I remember people didn't sleep for 48 hours at a time because we were working for deadlines and they wanted to get it just perfect. So what the legal team in Verity has done is actually now done this again and updated it for today. And I think it's a really important document to share. And there's a lot of important understanding that comes out of it and lots of ways that we can learn how government can improve. So I know that this cultural change is incomplete. You still hear people saying when we have this IMF tracker, I was reading in a singular paper this morning that Subhashini shared with me, Verity does not have all the information on what we are doing under the IMF program. How can they say this is not done? The outrage really should come the other way. How come we don't have that information? Despite looking everywhere, filing RTIs, asking government, who is the IMF program for if it is not for the people of Sri Lanka? Is it for the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.? But that idea that the IMF program is for somebody else is the very reason that Sri Lanka has failed almost 50% of its IMF programs. been in IMF programs for 28 years in the last 56 years, for exactly half the time. And this will not do in terms of how Sri Lanka progresses and goes on to develop. So we must try to work at it and change it. And that's why I'm particularly grateful for the civil servants and public officers who have joined us today, marking with their presence the difference in the values that they hold, the support they have for what is being done. And I want to name some of them who've arrived before I got up to stand. If anybody has arrived afterwards, and maybe others will mention you. And this is in no particular order, but simply the attendance list we had. We have Gayani Samarakon, RTI Officer, Ministry of Environment, with us here today. Harshika Nilakshi, Assistant Secretary, Ministry of Ports. Jeevani Kodituakku, Assistant Director, IT, Ministry of Women and Child Affairs. Mr. M.L. Gamanpilla, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Public Administration. PMPM Dharmasena, Development Officer and RTI Consultant, Ministry of Mass Media. And I must say the Ministry of Mass Media has been great in working with us. So, it's one of these things that you can't paint everything with the same brush, and Verite is known for being quite critical of government. But we also know there are fantastic people in government, fantastic, eras in certain ministries, and in this particular time, we have really been helped rather a lot by the Ministry of Mass Media. And even then, when we did the first report, the interest they took, the follow-up they did, the coaching they wanted to do on RTI has been a source of real encouragement for us as well. Then there's Subhashini Kahatapitia, Director of Planning and Monitoring, Ministry of Women and Child Affairs as well. And also, we have a member of parliament with us, and there are others to come, from a sectoral oversight committee on an open and accountable government, Honorable Mohammed Muzami, from the Sri Lanka Podujana Perumal. So we want to thank all of you, because I think, we want to be clear, this is not some kind of, battle between people and government. This is a battle for making Sri Lanka better. And working with all those who believe that Sri Lanka can be better. And that improvement we can bring doesn't simply come from, believing that somebody else is going to fix the problem, but in believing that we can create a system where government is for the people and is willing to share information, to learn together, to improve together, and move forward. So just before we continue, I also want to mention the people we have speaking today. The team that did this is led by a very prominent lawyer. She was a prosecuting attorney in New York and then decided to come to Sri Lanka and say, look, this is what I want to do. Nishana Veerasuriya, and she'll speak after me. We have Shannon Thaleratna, who will make the main presentation of the report and tell you how we quantified all the aspects of disclosure and proactive disclosure. As panelists, we have Additional Secretary Mr. Kalum Vijayanayaka. We also have, that's of the Ministry of Media. Then we have Kumar Lopez, CEO, Sri Lanka Press Institute, which plays a very important function in training journalists and training them on RTI as well. And thank you, Kumar, for accepting our invitation. And then Sankita Gunaratna from Transparency International Sri Lanka. She's the Deputy Executive Director. And Transparency, as you know, also has been much more than Verite. I mean, these organizations have been at the forefront of coaching and championing the improvement in information in Sri Lanka. So our task is not that we are the leaders in this. We are simply the people who try to create quantifiable methods of understanding and documenting and share it with people like the Press Institute, like TISL, who can really take that and then run in society with it, and the government as well. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you will stay on for bites and other things afterwards, that you will ask lots of questions, and more importantly, that when we are done here, that we will not be done, that the message and the ideas we convey will go with you and permeate and percolate within government, and start sowing the seeds of making things better in the country. Thank you very much, and let me invite Nishana to take the stage here.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I have a couple of housekeeping things before I kind of start introducing the presentation. First, I just want to say that we are very happy to see such a packed audience. It is extremely fruitful. I hope we have extremely fruitful discussion. I just want to flag for everyone that we do have translation services available if anyone would need. We have people who are walking around. We have Shanika in the red, who is happy to kind of provide any headsets if you would like. The presentations are going to be in English, while the panel discussion will be both in Sinhala and English. But we do want to make sure that everyone is able to participate in the conversation as well. I also want to add two people to Nishan's list who I think are here. We have a representative from the Ministry of Finance, and we also have the Labor Ministry as well. So thank you very much for attending. I will keep it very short and brief because I think Nishan has touched on quite a few of the things that I'm going to be mentioning. But I think first and foremost is to kind of make sure that we are all on the same page in understanding that the RTI Act was in fact a milestone for transparency and democracy in Sri Lanka, as it provides a framework for the public to not only access information held by public authorities, but what we're here to talk about is importantly for public authorities to actually disclose that information to the public. So, the value of proactive disclosure is also very much in the implementation of proactive disclosure obligations by public authorities. Otherwise, we aren't able to actually achieve the objectives articulated in the preamble of the Act. And those objectives, just for you to kind of recall, which I'm sure many of you will remember, is about combating corruption, promoting accountability, and good governance. Continuously, one of the problems that we do face in Sri Lanka, however, is that although there may be a law in place, there isn't always compliance or implementation with that law. So, as Nishan mentions, that's really why Verity wanted to encourage a culture of compliance by giving appreciation to the public authorities who do well in their obligations when it comes to proactive disclosure under the Act. As Nishan mentioned, the team did create the methodology in 2017 with the support of the World Bank at the time. We also, wanted to thank at the time the extremely valuable feedback from the Right to Commission Act, or Right to RTI Act Commission at the time. Now in 2017, as Shannon will kind of go through and explain, there was very poor implementation across the board when it came to public authorities in 2017. We have, in fact, seen much more compliance, which Shannon will talk through to you about. And in the second assessment, we've shared the findings with the Ministry of Mass Media, so we do want to thank the Ministry of Mass Media. And we were also able to share the findings with the RTI Commission as well. So at this time, I would like to introduce our presenters. We have Shannon Talyaratne to present our findings from this year's Proactive Disclosure Assessment. And following her will be Chatani Prabhsara, who will delve a little deeper into Section 9 and present some interesting findings related to Infrastructure Watch. Shannon, all yours.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for making the time to be here today. So we're so excited to present the findings of this assessment. And as Nishana and Nishan mentioned, the purpose of this assessment is to quantify something that's not easily quantifiable. So we know that proactive disclosure in Sri Lanka is poor, and the purpose of this assessment is to understand how poor. And now we can study this now quantifiable area to understand what we need to do to improve. So as Nishana mentioned, we first developed and tested the methodology for this assessment in 2017 with the support of the World Bank, and the report that's being launched today is the second in a series of reports that will continue to assess proactive disclosure in Sri Lanka. So in terms of the scope of this assessment, we looked at the proactive disclosure of 31 public authorities. So this includes 29 cabinet ministries and the 2 offices of the president and the prime minister. So a limitation of this assessment would be that we did not look at the proactive disclosure of the departments or the offices or the bodies that fall under the cabinet ministries. But you will notice that I talk about the Board of Investment. So the Board of Investment is not a cabinet ministry, but the Ministry of Investment Promotion did not have a website during the period of monitoring. So instead, we monitored the website of the BOI, which is the largest institution that falls under the Ministry of Investment Promotion. The monitoring period was in December 2022. And in terms of what we were looking for in this assessment, we drew the proactive disclosure requirements from the RTI Act. So particularly, we looked at Section 8, Section 9, and Regulation 20 under the Act. Section 8 requires a minister to publish a report with information on the ministry, so the functions of the ministry and its activities. Section 9 requires the minister to publish information, project information, before a project commences. And Regulation 20 requires information about the budget and the operations of the ministry to be routinely disseminated. A limitation of this assessment is that Section 10 of the RTI Act does not fall within the scope of this assessment. So Section 10, as I'm sure you know, requires public authorities to submit an annual report to the RTIC with the ministry's RTI information. But Section 10 was not a part of this assessment, but we are hoping to conduct a separate assessment next year on Section 10. So based on Section 8, 9, and Regulation 20 of the RTI Act, we drew 30 categories of information that need to be proactively disclosed, and this is what we looked for on public authorities' websites. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about the methodology. So in monitoring public authorities, we look for 2 things. Has the public authority disclosed information on its website? And once this information has been disclosed, the next thing we assess is usability. So in assessing usability, we look at 3 things. The first is language. So the information that's available, is it available in English, Sinhala, and Tamil? We also look at ease of access. So how quickly can you find the information on the website? How many clicks does it take for you to get to what you're looking for? And finally, we also look at format under usability. So once you have now found this information, how easily can you extract data from it? How easily can you copy and paste from the website? So if a public authority discloses information, they are awarded a content disclosure score, which is weighted at 75%. And once this information is disclosed, depending on how usable it is, they're also awarded a usability score, which is weighted at 25%. A combination of these scores gives us a composite score. And that composite score is then used to rank the public authorities. The composite score will also determine which band a public authority would fall within. So for an example, if a ministry was awarded a 55% composite score, they would fall in the yellow area in the moderately satisfactory band. So let's look at some of the key findings from this year's assessment. The top ranking public authorities for this year's assessment are the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Public Administration. So big congratulations to these 2 ministries for emerging as the top ranking ministries in this year's assessment. In terms of the lowest or bottom ranking ministries, we have the offices of the President and the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Technology. I mentioned before that proactive disclosure requirements are drawn from Section 9 of the RTI Act, which looks at project information. So we're talking about feasibility and pre-feasibility studies, detailed project costs, monitoring and evaluation reports. And the findings of this year's assessment are that project information disclosure is very low, with 80% of public authorities scoring less than 40% for project information disclosure. So that's 24 out of 31 public authorities scored less than 40% for project information disclosure. And when we compare to the numbers in 2017, there has been some improvement, because in 2017, all the public authorities scored less than 40%. So proactive disclosure under Section 9 is an area that Verite looks at in more depth under our Infrastructure Watch platform. So this assessment looks at project information by ministry, whereas Infrastructure Watch looks at project information disclosure by project. And in a little bit, my colleague Chatuni will talk to us a little bit more about the Infrastructure Watch platform. So before I mention that one of the things that we look at under usability is language. So overall, across the 31 public authorities that we monitored, these are the total percentage scores in terms of language. So what these scores tell us is that the majority of information is available in English and less information is available in Sinhala and Tamil. Now, in terms of the country's official language policy, Sinhala and Tamil are the official and national languages of the country, and information needs to be published in these two languages. English is only identified as a linked language, but these findings are very concerning because based on the English score, we understand that just about 50% of information is disclosed in general. The Sinhala score tells us that only under 40% of information is accessible to the Sinhala-speaking population. And if you look at the Tamil score, it tells us that under 30% of information is accessible to the Tamil-speaking population. So because of how concerning these language findings were, we also assessed what we call language bias. So it's a little complex, but assessing language bias involves comparing a public authority's score for English disclosure to their score for Sinhala as a percentage of their English score. So the reason we use English as the benchmark is because, as we saw before, English is the highest performing language. So the language bias that we observe across some of the public authorities are illustrated here. So what it means when we say that the Board of Investment has high bias against Sinhala language is that the Board of Investment is more likely to prioritize information on its website in English over Sinhala content. So the BOI had only 43% of information available in English and only 4% of information available in Sinhala. But on the far side, you can see the ministries that have emerged with no bias. So these public authorities, if they had information available in English, it was also available in Sinhala. So we have the Ministry of Wildlife, the Office of the President, the Ministry of Transport, and the Ministry of Ports emerging with no bias. And then in terms of an English to Tamil comparison, this assessment reveals that the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Irrigation were more likely to prioritize English language content over Tamil language content. So if we take the Ministry of Irrigation, their English percentage score was 57% and their Tamil language score was 7%. But again, we see the Ministry of Wildlife and the Office of the President emerging with no bias. So content available in English, also available in Tamil. Out of curiosity, we also assess language bias between Sinhala and Tamil. So we use Sinhala as the benchmark here. And before we saw that the Ministry of Transport had high bias against Tamil when compared to English. And what this analysis shows us is even when you compare to Sinhala, the Ministry of Transport shows high bias against Tamil. But the Ministry of Wildlife and the Office of the President consistently have disclosed information in all three languages. So these two public authorities are the most language-friendly public authorities. If you find information on their website in English, it's guaranteed to be available in Sinhala and Tamil. In terms of checking for ease of access, like I mentioned before, we looked at how many clicks it takes to find information on the website. So these are the scores for English ease of access. And what that means is we checked how many clicks it takes to access information on the English website. Similarly, for format, we looked at how easily you can copy and paste information on the English website. Now, when ease of access and format were accessed in English, 68% of public authorities scored between 41 and 60% for ease of access and format. But when we compared this to ease of access and format in Sinhala and Tamil, 84% of public authorities fell within the 11 to 40% band for ease of access and format in Sinhala and Tamil. Now, what this tells us is we saw before that under the official language policy, proactive disclosure is important in Sinhala and Tamil, but we saw that Sinhala and Tamil disclosure is low. What this analysis tells us is that once you find information in Sinhala and Tamil, it's going to be harder for you to access that information. It's also going to be harder for you to copy and paste that information as opposed to an English website. And after completing the scoring for 2022, Verite produced a formula for assessing government openness in Sri Lanka using the scores from this proactive disclosure assessment. So government openness is calculated by looking at the total content disclosure score and the total usability score, and we weighted it again at 75% and 25%, and we come to our government openness score. So from 2017 to 2022, government openness has only increased from 25% to 33%. So I think, as Nishan mentioned before, just 5 years in, we only see an 8 percentage point increase. And this is due to the fact that a large number of ministries have very minimal content disclosure available on their websites. And that contributes overall to this very low government openness score. This is a QR code that you can use to access this year's report, and I would now like to invite my colleague Chatuni to present the findings of Verite's Infrastructure Watch Assessment for 2023.
Thank you, Shannon. So, as mentioned during Shannon's presentation, the requirements for proactive disclosure are set out under Sections 8 and 9 of the RTI Act, as well as Regulation 20. And the assessment that Shannon just spoke about covers all these three areas. But this particular assessment zooms in on Section 9 of the RTI Act. So as Shannon mentioned, Section 9 of the RTI Act is concerned with the proactive disclosure of information relating to projects. And it requires the minister responsible for a large-scale project to disclose information proactively 3 months prior to its commencement or 1 week prior in the event of an urgent project. So why is Section 9 of particular importance? So it's a well-documented fact that infrastructure plays an important role in facilitating trade, transport, production to drive economic growth. So investment in infrastructure is vital for development. However, infrastructure projects are vulnerable to high risks of corruption as they tend to be large, complex, and long-term projects. So these are all fertile grounds for corruption. So countries with weak governance frameworks for public investment management are particularly vulnerable. And large-scale projects in Sri Lanka have been mired with allegations of corruption, procurement malpractices, higher costs, and negative environmental impacts. So, for example, inflated costs of infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka compared to other countries in the region is a well-documented fact. So, high levels of borrowing to finance these infrastructure projects at higher costs have also played a role in the debt crisis that is faced by the country, because these loans have led to a higher repayment burden that is ultimately borne by the Sri Lankan taxpayers. So lack of transparency is a key enabler for many of the issues that are associated with infrastructure investments in Sri Lanka. So the Right to Information Act, which was brought into effect in 2016, attempted to change this by enabling public access to vital government information and empowering citizens to hold the government accountable. But previous research by Verite shows that compliance with proactive disclosure requirements under Section 9 remains to be low, with poor accessibility of information online. And of particular concern is the poor accessibility of information in both Sinhala and Tamil. So given these shortcomings, Verite assessed the proactive disclosure of information online for 60 infrastructure projects with the aim of increasing awareness regarding proactive disclosure requirements and enhancing public demand for compliance. So it's worth noting that what we have carried out here is a project-wise assessment of disclosure of information under Section 9, while the assessment that Shannon previously spoke about was conducted ministry-wise. So we first conducted this assessment in 2022, where we assessed proactive disclosure of information in relation to 60 large-scale infrastructure projects that were implemented between 2019 and 2021. So these findings have also been published under Infrastructure Watch, which is a trilingual dashboard housed under Verite's publicfinance.lk. So The assessment was carried out for a second time in 2023, where we once again assessed proactive disclosure of information online for 60 large-scale infrastructure projects that were worth 2.54 trillion rupees. So of these, 60% of the projects were locally funded and amounted to 1.86 trillion rupees, while 40% of the projects were funded by foreign funders and were worth 680 billion rupees. So guidelines issued under Section 1B of the RTI Act requires agencies to disclose 40 different points of information that are grouped under 5 different categories. So this includes project details, rationale, budget and financial details, approvals and clearances, and also procurement and contracts. So the guidelines also require the information on large projects to be disclosed in Sinhala and Tamil, and if feasible in English, and also for such information to be available in a digital electronic format on the ministry website. And in our assessment, which was carried out between January and April of this year, we investigated the online availability of these 40 points of information for each project on ministry and line agency websites, as well as the accessibility of the published information in all 3 languages. So the findings of the assessment reveal 2 critical issues. Firstly, there's low overall information disclosure, with only 25% of the required information proactively disclosed. While there has been a marginal increase compared to 2022, 75% of the information that is required to be proactively disclosed remains undisclosed. So lack of transparency and accountability of the government about the spending of public funds have been key contributory factors in the current crisis. So therefore, in the context of the current crisis, transparency regarding the use and effectiveness of taxpayer funds is a critical step towards building public trust and a sustainable economic recovery. However, our findings paint a picture of a government that is continuing to do much of its business behind closed doors, defying legal mandates. So another critical issue highlighted by the assessment is the low level of disclosure in local languages, which was also highlighted during Shannon's presentation. So not only do agencies fail to share most of the information they are required to proactively disclose, but when they do so in English. So this is especially concerning because Section 9(1)(b) of the RTI Act mandates disclosure of information in Sinhala and Tamil, and with English required to be used only if feasible. However, in practice, authorities are appearing to do the exact opposite of this. So this is problematic because the limited availability of information in Sinhala and Tamil means that non-English speakers of the population, who account for 69% of the population, are deprived of access to more than 2/3 of the information. So we also looked at whether there was a difference in disclosure levels across foreign and locally funded projects. And what we found is that locally funded projects by funders including the government of Sri Lanka, the Sri Lanka Ports Authority, and the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation experienced lower level of disclosure compared to foreign funded projects. And this was the case in both 2022 and 2023. So, as I mentioned earlier, guidelines issued under Section 9(1)(b) requires agencies to disclose 40 different points of information that are grouped under 5 broad categories. So, our findings show that information disclosure is higher for basic project details, including project details, project rationale and beneficiaries, and project budget and financial details. However, the share of information disclosed is extremely low for project approvals and clearances and project procurement and contracts. So this includes information on necessary clearances, information about the contractor, contract signed, and whether it's a solicited or unsolicited projects. So these are 2 key areas that are prone to misuse and abuse by power and authority, and are areas critical to improving infrastructure governance, because low levels of disclosure and the resulting opacity creates fertile ground for corruption, malpractices, higher costs, and lower quality of infrastructure. So the importance of increasing disclosure about procurement contracts has also been recognized by the IMF because a commitment to disclose public procurement contracts through an online fiscal transparency platform has been included in Sri Lanka's 2023 IMF program. So what's interesting is that Regulation 20 and Section 9 of the RTI Act and its guidelines, which were in place before the IMF program, already required disclosure regarding information on procurement and contracts. So the RTI Act has been in force since 2016, but as you've seen from our findings, even after all these years, compliance with proactive disclosure requirements under the RTI Act remains extremely low. And the disclosure of public procurement contracts is now also an IMF condition. So this commitment was tracked by Verity's IMF Tracker, which is an online tool that tracks the progress of government commitments in Sri Lanka's IMF program. And the online transparency platform was to be operational by March 2023, but the platform was not established by the 31st of March, and the commitment was not met. So lack of transparency and accountability of government about the use of public funds have been key factors in the current crisis. And so increased transparency and accountability about the use of public funds have been identified as critical to reducing corruption vulnerabilities and ensuring a sustainable economic recovery. But it seems that the government is reluctant to adhere to the provisions of the RTI Act and to international agreements, and this is highly problematic going forward because it's been agreed that governance is critical to achieving sustainable economic recovery. So this begs the question as to whether the government will continue to carry much of its business behind closed doors even after the crisis, disregarding local legislation and international agreements. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I would like to invite you all to visit the Infrastructure Watch dashboard, which is housed under publicfinance.lk, where our findings from both the 2022 and 2023 assessments are published. Thank you.
Thank you to both Shannon and to Chathani for their wonderful presentation. I now have the pleasure of inviting our panelists onto the stage. So first, I would like to invite our panel chair, Subhashini Abhay-Singhar, who is the research director at Verity Research. She's an economist who specializes in international trade and is an expert on the Sri Lankan economy, private sector development, trade policy, WTO, regional trade agreements, ports, and logistics. In addition to these, her current research includes data-driven analysis of China's economic engagement in Sri Lanka. She has a bachelor's degree in economics, a master's degree in economics from the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, and a master's degree in international law and economics from the World Trade Institute, University of Bern, Switzerland. She worked for the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for nearly 10 years as a senior economist. She also worked as a visiting lecturer at the Faculty of Graduate Studies of the University of Colombo and the Sri Jan Kotalava Defense University in Sri Lanka. Subhashini, please join us on the stage. I believe we will also have, I'm going to have the translation services, if you could just hand them out to our panelists as they come up. Next, I have the pleasure of inviting Ms. Sankitha Gunaratna. She is the Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. She is a graduate of the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo. She's an attorney at law and a Chevening Scholar with a Master of Arts in Corruption and Governance from the University of Sussex. She has experience in legal practice in company and tax law and has worked with multiple governance-related civil society organizations prior to joining Transparency International Sri Lanka. She currently serves on the board of the UNCAC Coalition, a global network of over 350 civil society organizations in over 100 countries committed to promoting the ratification, implementation, and monitoring of the UN Convention Against Corruption. She is an anti-corruption advocate with years of experience pushing for transparent, accountable, and participatory governance in Sri Lanka. She specializes in the right to information, election campaign finance, public sector integrity, private sector corruption, and international asset recovery. Her past work spans from project management to advocacy and community training. Sankitha, please join us on the stage. I would next like to invite Mr. Kellam Wijanayaka, who is the Additional Secretary of Development, Planning, and RTI of the Ministry of Mass Media. Mr. Wijanayaka graduated with honors from in chemistry at the University of Colombo. He worked as a quality assurance executive at Haley's Volcano Group for 4 years. He joined the public service as an administrative service officer in 2000. He has worked as an assistant secretary for the Ministry of Tourism and assistant commissioner at the Department of Agrarian Development. He was the deputy director of the Department of Rubber Development. He was also the commissioner at the Department of Cooperative Development, Southern Province. He was also the senior assistant secretary at the Ministry of Women and Child Development and the additional secretary at the Ministry of Industries. He holds a master's in public administration from the Sri Lanka Institute of Development Administration and a master of sociology at the University of Kelaniya. Please join us. And finally, we have Mr. Kumar Lopez, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Sri Lanka Press Institute. Mr. Kumar Lopez has been actively involved in the media field for the past 10 years as the Chief Executive Officer of the Sri Lanka Press Institute. He also has extensive experience in the field of management, IT, and development work. He holds an MBA from the University of Wales and is a chartered IT professional of the British Computer Society. Please do join us. Thanks, Subhashi.
Thank you, Nishana. I think we have a great panel, especially from different backgrounds, who can provide us different perspectives of proactive disclosure and the value of proactive disclosure. And especially the objective of today's discussion is really to find constructive solutions, like how can we understand the gaps, we understand the challenges, and what we want to do today is really see how can we reduce these gaps and what are the challenges we need to overcome and what are the solutions that we can propose and we can think about in this respect. So let me first start with the opening remarks from the panelists and then open to everyone in the audience to ask questions. So I will start with Sankita, especially like Nishan said, like everyone said, Transparency International has been in the forefront in creating awareness and also encouraging use of Right to Information Act, and you have worked a lot with civil society and grassroots organizations. So I would like to know your perspective of proactive disclosure and especially briefly, what you think we can do to really address the current gaps in compliance.
Thank you, Subhashini. So when you look at the Right to Information Act, it really stands on two main pillars. One is reactive disclosure, and one is proactive disclosure. So when you think about right to information, though, most people tend to focus on reactive disclosure. It's all about RTI applications. So it's really good to see the research done by Verite to keep up the pressure on the proactive disclosure front. Because really, if proactive disclosure were to be improved further in the country, then it would reduce the burden on public authorities to make information available on an ongoing basis. It will reduce the number of letters that Nishan was talking about, for example. But it would also reduce the burden on the citizen to file a right to information request. And that's a heavy burden to bear, really. And especially in our context in Sri Lanka, where questioning authority doesn't necessarily come naturally to us, and it's not perceived positively. When we go out to the people, when we do trainings, often the question that is asked us is, do we have to put our name? Do we have to put our real name? Should we put our address? And it takes a while to even convince people that that information is necessary to send a response to you, right? Because we have this fear of the state. We have this understanding of the state as being more powerful than us, of being above us, and it goes even further. It's a lot more intimidating than that also. So that's what you're setting people up to do when you are asking them to file right to information requests. So it's taken a lot of effort over several years to try and change this narrative among public officials and among citizens to say that this is a conversation, that you can file an RTI request in the morning and still look a person in the face and speak to them straight, like it wasn't a challenge, you know, it was just a normal part of our democracy. So in this context, it's really, really important to have focus on proactive disclosure. And I know the research in 2017 and in 2022 focused on online proactive disclosure, but I think in terms of the conversation, we can take it a little bit beyond that and talk about proactive disclosure outside of the online space as well. So as has been very laudably recognized by the research methodology, proactive disclosure is really about, first, availability of information, and secondly, accessibility of information. So just having information out there in, say, a PDF document that no one can really, that has 100 pages and you don't know where to look for the information is not good enough. So an example that is often used in the kind of RTI space is about this panchayat in India, that where the community got together and wrote some of the critical information that is needed for the people on the walls of the panchayat. So they wrote it in big painted letters so that people could access it at any time. But just today, one of our staff members alerted me to the Bandaravela Municipal Council that has put the Citizens Charter in the form of an image with a QR code. So the Citizens Charter in Sri Lanka is this concept which puts up services that the authority offers to the people and then gives a timeline within which that service will be performed by that public authority. So when you scan the QR code, it actually takes you to a website that shows the process also and the information needed to access that information. So this is, in terms of best practice, it's really progressive to see this kind of thing happen in Sri Lanka. So that what you're going back to those first principles of not just availability, but about accessibility of necessary information. So I'm going to take it a step further, because when you think about proactive disclosure, you don't want to be offered a whole bunch of information that you're not necessarily going to be using. So it's about whether you can get access to the information that you want for the service or data that you want at the time when you need it. So how do we really do this? How do we really do this? I know there have been other Sri Lankans who have talked about geolocating the information. As you need it, it arrives on your phone. Now with the advent of AI and things like that, there is a lot of potential to what can be done. But of course, we must do this with due regard to privacy, with due regard to ethics, and with due care. We can look at social media. If a lot of us are spending so much time on social media, can public authorities make information available in a palatable way through these kinds of means? So when you think about information disclosure for the purpose of anti-corruption, we shouldn't only think about how we get information and then fight the fight against corruption, but also the perspective that information availability makes corruption harder to do, which means it serves as a deterrent to corruption. Right? When information is out there, when your signature is out there, when your name is associated with certain bits of information, when your duties and functions are out there, you'd be a lot more hesitant to engage in corruption. So the deterrent effect of information disclosure, I think, also is not to be disregarded. I'll also pivot a little bit because of the infrastructure watch and the poor findings, not the poor findings, but the findings of how poor information disclosure is in Sri Lanka. I'll pivot a little bit to what we can do with data, and Subhashini, this speaks to your work at Verite as well. if you look at just the subject of procurement, if this almost utopian disclosure requirements were met, there's a lot you can do to identify red flags for corruption. I'll just take procurement as an example. If the time period between the advertising of a complex procurement bid tender and the awarding of that particular tender is a very short time period, you can almost bet that that tender procedure is corrupt, because there is no way suppliers can get all of that information organized and all of those costs of forming a tender covered within that short period of time, because often these are very technical exercises. If a company has been incorporated a very short while before a major government contract is awarded to them, then that is a red flag for corruption. So if this information is out there in numbers for all of these, the projects that, or the tender awards that a government engages in, there is a lot that data analysis can do to figure out trends in corruption. So it's useful, proactive disclosure of information is useful both from a deterrent perspective and from the perspective of catching corruption, both as the big picture, but also in individual instances. I'll stop here, but I'm happy to respond to further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sankita. So that idea of how transparency deters corruption is very interesting, because I always feel when I hear of RTI, it's like a CCTV camera, right? So when there is a CCTV around, people just hesitate a little bit, even if they want to do something wrong. So I think the light that this act sheds on certain activities of the government is very, very important. So now I would like to turn to Additional Secretary Vijay Nayaka, because I think all of this conversation has focused on the demand side, from the public side. But it is very important to understand the story of the government and what the government can do to really reduce this gap. What are some of the challenges, but more so the solutions. Would love to hear your thoughts, Additional Secretary.
සුබ සන්ධ්‍යාවක් සියලු දෙනාටම. ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී පාලනයක ප්‍රධානම ලක්ෂණයක් වෙන්නේ මහා ජනතාව සහ රජය අතර මනා සම්බන්ධතාවයක්. මේ මනා සම්බන්ධතාවය පවත්වාගෙන යාම නම් පවත්වාගෙන යාමට රජය පිළිබඳ මහා ජනතාව පැහැදිලි නිවැරදි චිත්‍රයක් මවා ගත යුතුයි. මේ සඳහා නිවැරදි තොරතුරු ඉතා වැදගත් සාධකයක් වෙනවා. તો නිවැරදි තොරතුරු දැනගන්න නම් මේ RTI Act එක හොඳ platform එකක් සපයනවා. එතකොට ඒකේ 8-9 වගන්ති සහ 20 වෙනි නියෝගයේ යටතේ මේ තොරතුරු ප්‍රගාමී තොරතුරු කොහොමද දෙන්න ඕන කියලා පැහැදිලිව සඳහන් වෙනවා. නමුත් මේ සඳහා research findings බැලුවම යම් දුර්වලතාවයක් තියෙන බව අනාවරණය වෙනවා. ඉතින් මේකෙදී අපි යෝජනා කරනවා ප්‍රධානම කරුණු 3ක් යටතේ අපි ක්‍රියාමාර්ග ගත යුතු වෙනවා. එක තමයි මේ පිළිබඳව අපි RTI Act එක පටන් ගත්ත දවස්වල ගොඩක් awareness program දැනුවත් කිරීමේ වැඩසටහන් තිබුණා. ඒ වගේ නැවත ඉහළ රජයේ නිලධාරීන් වගේම පුළුවන්කමක් තියෙනවා නම් පාර්ලිමේන්තු මන්ත්‍රීවරු ඉඳලා දැනුවත් කිරීමේ වැඩසටහන් ක්‍රියාත්මක awareness program ක්‍රියාත්මක කිරීම. ඒ වගේම ඊළඟ එක මේක ඉන්සෙන්ටිව් මොනවා හරි. ඒ කියන්නේ හොඳටම ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන ආයතන වලට යම් දීර්ඝන්වීම් ක්‍රමයක් ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් ඒක ඉතාමත් වැදගත් වෙනවා. ඒ වගේම මේ සමහර language bias ගැන කතා කරා. අපි භාෂාව මත තොරතුරු ලබා දීමේ යම් වෙනස්කමක් තියෙනවා කියලා කතා කරා. ඒකෙදි බොහෝ දුරට මේ project information කියන government එක සිංහලෙන් වැඩ කරාට documentary part කියන්නේ මේ ලේඛනගත කිරීම බොහෝ දුරට වෙන්නේ ඉංග්‍රීසි වලින්. ඒතකොට විශේෂයෙන් procurement කරන්නේ ඉංග්‍රීසි වලින් බොහෝ දුරට. ඒ කියන්නේ larger procurement යම් සුළු shopping ඇරෙන්න, ඒ කියන්නේ මේ shopping ඇරෙන්න අනිත් ඒවා. ඒතකොට මේවා translate කරලා website වලට දානවා කියන්නේ අමතර effort එකක්. ඒ නිසා මේ නිලධාරීන් අපි ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන්ම බලාත්මක කළ යුතුයි මේ තොරතුරු එකතු කරගෙන තොරතුරු ප්‍රගාමී තොරතුරු පබ්ලිෂ් කිරීම ප්‍රකාශ කිරීම පිළිබඳව. ඉතින් මම ඉන්නේ ඔන්න ඔය ක්‍රියාමාර්ග තුන මගින් තමයි මේ proactive discourse නැත්නම් ප්‍රගාමී තොරතුරු මහජනතාව වෙත ලබා දීමේ යම් ප්‍රගතියක් අපිට අත්කරගත හැකි වන්නේ. බොහොම ස්තුතියි.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි විජනායක මහත්මයා. මම හිතන්නේ ඉතාමත්ම වැදගත් අර සංකිතා දුන්න උදාහරණයත් බොහෝ රාජ්‍ය ආයතන අපි හැමෝම කතා වුණා වගේ රාජ්‍ය නිලධාරීන් ඉන්නවා beyond the call of duty. ඇත්තටම තමන්ට අවශ්‍ය තමන්ගේ minimum requirement එකට එහා ගිහිල්ලා මේ තොරතුරු ප්‍රගාමීව ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නට ඉදිරිපත් වෙන මම හිතන්නේ ඉතාමත්ම වැදගත් අපි එකිනෙකාගෙන් ඉගෙන ගැනීමත් සමහර ආයතන වලට සාර්ථකව යම් දේවල් කරගන්නට පුළුවන් නම් අනිකුත් ආයතන වලටත් එයට හැකියාව තිබිය යුතුයි කියන පදනමේ ඉඳලා මම හිතන්නේ අපිට මේ best practices වලින් ඉගෙන ගන්නත් විදි තියෙනවා. මම දැන් I would like to now turn to Kumar to understand, especially since you come from a journalist background and you interact frequently with the media and journalists. So, from the perspective of journalists, where do you see proactive disclosure and what are the suggestions you have about improving the current situation?
Thank you, Subhashini. First of all, let me congratulate Nishan, Veritas, Subhashini for the wonderful work that you all have done and the report that has come out. I think these, whatever it is, like at the end of the day, like data helps us to go take things further, to look at the next level, the gaps, look at the gaps and so on. So I think congratulations to your team and Nishan. So while I'm here, I'm also a little bit excited because the A-level results out, right? And I have a candidate at home who's waiting for the A-level results. So while there's an exciting event taking place, personally I'm also excited to get that call from home as to see what the result is. Nevertheless, so let's get on with our exciting event over here, right? So, I mean, as we all know, like, I mean, media brings about a discourse among the public, right? Communities, different groups, and so on in regard to various areas. And this comes out from information, right? And very recently, we have been having, we've been doing some research as well as some surveys to understand how journalists have also been using it, and very soon it will be available. I think one of the things that we need to understand is like journalists need information, right? And this information sometimes has been more from a reactive angle, right? Where like you have to file RTI, wait for the information, appeal, etc. and so on. So there's always been that delay. When you don't get the right information, probably your story, your narrative also changes, right? Which has an impact in the decision making of the general public, the key decision makers as well, right? So the journalist role, the media plays a major role in regard to getting that information to the public so that you can actually have the right decision made. Right? Now that actually puts the journalist to take on other measures. So where does it end? Sometimes it can actually go on to looking at different avenues of getting this information. And the information that they get sometimes could be valid, sometimes it can have a little bit of confusions and also doubts in regard to the information. And when that report goes out, it creates a wrong information, a wrong story, a wrong narrative, right? Then the public is informed in a poor manner, right? The decisions could also go in a wrong way, right? Investigative journalism is another aspect. Investigative journalists, like those who have access to data, access to information, they are able to create a report that actually enlightens the public as to what's happening around. I guess today we all would agree that, I mean, the countries in the state of it where it is today is because of the corruption that we have experienced, right? And investigative journalists have been doing their part, right? And there have been pieces coming in, but then definitely we are being challenged with this. Investigative journalists crave for information, crave for data, right? And this information, sometimes it's not easy to get, which means they risk their lives too, right? So where does proactive disclosure help? And you wouldn't believe proactive disclosure can also help lives, right? when an investigative journalist takes on that risk and goes on to take a story, that journalist is taking a risk, right? Puts a life in jeopardy, right? And we all know sometimes when you ask for information also, we find several journalists have been threatened with calls, right? Threatened in different ways, directly and indirectly. So it threatens them. So proactive disclosure in one angle, while it can actually help you to have the right information at the right time to make the right decision, right? It can also save lives, right? It can also save lives. So rather than being reactive, right? Proactive can actually help in many ways in regard to getting that information all the way to the ground. The second challenge that I also see from the journalist's point of view as well as from the angle of information consumption is something that we all challenge today, the amount of false information that is out there, right? Manipulation of data, manipulation of information, right? Different narratives, different perspectives that have been taken in regard to the right information, right? People are getting confused. Social media, may it be mainstream media, social media, and whatever media that is, right? So when a journalist who wants to get this information, where does he go to? Today you find sometimes we are looking at online, we're looking at social media, right, for leads, right? But then we have our own leads as well. But then if proactive disclosure is there, I think it helps to tackle the mis and disinformation and also the false narratives, right? So in many ways, like a proactive disclosure can actually help the journalist and also we as information consumers, right, in regard to taking the right decision. Yes, we are talking about AI, crawlers, scrapers that are all out there to scrape information. But at the end of the day, like we need to ensure that the data goes out there is authentic, right? Goes out there is authentic. And I think that's where like the media ministry's role comes into play, right? As a nodal ministry, I think we had a good, it was kind of a springboard initially, but then suddenly like, I mean, just like the free fall dives that we find in the Olympics, suddenly we had a free fall, right? You got the springboard, you went up, and then suddenly you're having a free fall. But I guess now it's important that we go on to the next springboard and come back. So the nodal ministry has a major role to do. And I think one of the important pieces that we could do in regard to taking it forward is definitely to have more collaboration, because I think the media ministry and the Ministry of Public Administration may have to sit together and work out modalities as to how you could actually push and take proactive disclosure to another level, right? We may need to have like a balanced scorecard or a scorecard that needs to kind of rate the state entities to kind of being given, not to say like, look, you guys are performing your jobs, right? So while, as I also endorse, there are so many good agencies, like the 33%, right, that we saw in the report that have disclosed, they have done their part to at least some extent. So we must appreciate that also. We shouldn't only talk about the negatives. But then we still have a long way to go, right? We still have a long way to go. So from a journalist point of view, like from the media point of view, the right information at the right time helps us to make the right decision and take the message to the public. So therefore, proactive disclosure actually helps us to take the authentic information, the right information, tackling the false information, mis and disinformation, and take it to the public in the right way.
Thank you very much, Kumar. I think you highlighted a very important point of disinformation and misinformation and how official information released by ministries and departments and agencies can really help. And it made me realize how much more important in Sinhala and Tamil, because sometimes these false narratives in Sri Lanka gets really, widespread in local languages. So journalists working in local languages, having access to right information empowers them to challenge this misinformation and disinformation and not also be people who also spread this information, because when they don't have access to information officially, that can actually challenge that position. So I would like to now open the floor to questions. So feel free to ask questions. I think we have our colleagues who can bring you a mic if you just raise your hand, and feel free to ask in any language, Tamil, Sinhala, or English. Yes.
Congratulations, Verite. You all seem to be right and top in terms of doing research of public interest and sharing that with the public as well. Very effective. Dr. Dimel, thank you very much. I'm here. Okay. I'm Hemasiri Kotagama. I'm representing the Center for Poverty Analysis. I have two questions that relate to the methodology, not to the general subject, which I'm ignorant of. So in your methodology, you all have selected focusing on projects. Okay, and then we applauded the Ministry of Agriculture for sharing information about projects proactively. Now, could it be that the Ministry of Agriculture gets more foreign funded and so forth projects than other ministries? How did you standardize this across the ministries? How did you standardize it across the ministries? And then, if you consider projects alone, that does not really reflect the performance of ministries in terms of even budgetary allocations. The general budget does not usually get allocated with projects alone. It is only new aspects that comes out as projects. Now, years back, the Ministry of Planning had a pipeline on projects that we could have monitored. So this aspect is one. Then I like to relate to an issue that the lady on stage raised. Now, we are looking at this from a supplier's point of view. Okay, so there is an act, this information ought to be shared. But shouldn't we consider it from the demand side of it? What is it that people want to know? Like what you said, the Panchayat had put it on a wall. So likewise, in your research approach, why did you not want to initiate the research by identifying what people really wanted to know from these ministries? So these two questions, how did you standardize it? And then why didn't you all get interested in knowing what people want to know? And then do the research on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So while Shannon can maybe get ready with the answer, I would like to maybe take a few more questions.
I'm happy to come in on those questions as well.
Right, sure.
But after you take more
Sure,
questions.
sure. Yeah, there's a question over there.
Thank you. My name is Lakshman Gunasekara. I'm a freelance journalist. I also must congratulate Verite for this really meticulous work, although gaps are there, I've already seen. But I want to also raise a kind of gap. First, I must also thank Kumar Lopez for his incisive, very quick summary of how the news media industry approaches this. And I really must appreciate that. But that's what prompted me to think about the current state of public information, and that is we are no longer at all in a structure of a news industry. That's virtually dying. The fourth estate is not the kind of power it used to be at all, and we all are aware of the new power that is in the room. Social media, not just social media, but the internet and web communications. Now, that is an entirely different system of public information. It's where there is direct public, individual public consumption, and also direct organized public consumption, quite outside what is conventionally known as the news industry. So, my question is how much importance can we give, and I'm addressing it to the panel itself, also to Verite, can we give to that dimension of consumption and demand, which also is highlighted by the representative from SIPA, where there is no longer controlled outlets for information flow, but completely direct competition, but also direct inquiry and probing and even hacking for public information. How is it that can be handled in terms of proactive disclosure? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there a, yeah, there's one more question over here. Can we get a mic here? Here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, congratulations to Verite. It's a very interesting report. Thank you so much. I wanted to pick up on this idea of right to reasons, which is also in the Act somewhere, Section 35 or 32. And I'm just wondering whether there is any way in which this can be integrated into the methodology when you go forward. So, going back to the question that he raised earlier, what do people want to know? And is there a way you can also ask public authorities to disclose why, say, they pick a company that's been recently set up, or why have they gone with a particular procurement decision, the sort of whys. And I know this whole idea of right to reasons has been sort of ignored in the RTI, sort of the way it's been applied. But is there a way of trying to integrate this as one of the dimensions of proactive disclosure? The other interesting point that came up was the locally funded projects and the foreign funded projects. So locally funded projects, lack transparency. Foreign funded projects perhaps had a little more. Is there any way of engaging with donors around proactive disclosure in trying to? Sorry. Is there any way of trying to engage with donors to also get them to push government agencies in terms of disclosing information? So whether it be World Bank funded projects or ADB funded projects, to ask them to also insist that this is sort of built into the sort of project disclosure agreements, and even as a last step, going to the compliance review panel or the inspection panel and sort of seeking review where it's funded by the ADB or the World Bank. Finally, a sort of comment on language. And I think it's quite a burden to ask state institutions to publish in all three languages, right? And I'm just wondering, going forward, whether we should also be investing. This is, of course, a little ambitious, but investing a little more in AI to translate, material that can make it much easier for state institutions. Even if you can't disclose the whole report, at least a summary of what you might produce, either in Sinhala and Tamil, produce it in English, or the other way around. So it's an ambitious idea, obviously, but we should be thinking, I think, of using AI in this way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe I'll start with Nishan on the first question, and then Shannon can add. Is Nishan? Yeah. So okay, and then Shannon can add if she wants to.
So I'll just take the maybe first two questions, and others can add on standardization by Hemanta, and Lakshman's question on social media, which Lakshman, I'll try to interpret the question and then reply. So I think if I try to understand the question, it's some ministries you think have it easier because they have foreign funded projects which then provide information. Other ministries have it harder. If you attempt to do some kind of subjective judgment on what's easy, what's hard, you keep having more and more questions like that. Like, why do you say it's easy for me? Why not? So I think it's also quite, and I'll give you a harder standardization problem, which I think we should solve. Like some categories of information are like basic ones. Ministry name, function, how to contact the minister, things like that. And other categories are more complex. So you could also say, well, why are they weighted equally, right? And that's, I would say, a more interesting problem of standardization than trying to figure out whether one ministry had it easy or not because of foreign funded projects. So I think in general, the answer to the first part of the question is you have to just look at the outcome. And people have projects, and if they have projects, they still have the exact same obligation to be transparent And this is not about measuring level of effort required, it's about level of achievement. And you get this everywhere. We must ultimately, there's a law. The law has a requirement, and this is simply a fairly objective standpoint. It says, how good are you at meeting the requirements of the law? And that's the standard. Now, is it easier for some, harder for some? It's always going to be. But once there's a law, you're expected to meet that standard. And I think that is the evaluation that's given. It's some people find it easier to do the A-levels, some people harder, but there's a standard to get into university, and you're all expected to perform to that standard to some extent, right? So, but I think we also have breakdowns of how they perform in different categories of information. So if somebody says, look, there's some set of information that's easy, then maybe we can go and look how are they different. Now, we can't publish PowerPoints on every single aspect, but the data set is there. And I think for ministries that want to kind of figure out where am I doing better or worse, we can always help them with that data. So I hope you understand why it is important to use an objective standard of outcomes and achievement versus a subjective standard of is it easy for you or harder for you to achieve it. Lakshman, I think maybe your question was, and I'm sorry if I didn't listen carefully enough, is it, why are we looking at on a website when the world has moved to social media? So I think if it's not on a website, it's actually quite hard to get it into social media. So, social media is an amplification, communication, spreading technology. Websites are a publishing technology today. So we look first whether it actually exists, and then we might say, look, you need to do more. You need to now spread this into social media. You need to share it with others. But this test that we are running here is simply the question of, are you doing the very basic thing of actually even having that information, after which we might be able to add another layer, I think, later on that. So that's thank you. That's the way to think about it. And, these are great questions, and I think it's thank you for asking them. I'll pass on the next section. Mario's questions also very interesting. I'm sure there are others in the room who'd want to address them. Yeah, thank you.
So to add Nishan said, there was another part to that question saying, why didn't we consider demand when we were deciding this thing? So again, I guess the same answer, objective versus subjective. When you assess demand, maybe what Verite thinks is as information that is demanded may be different from maybe journalists that Kumar represents think as important, and maybe think tanks or like Transparency International thinks as important. So it's very subjective. So for different groups of people, different types of information may be more important than others. So it is easier, and also we assume that Right to Information Act, when passed, had thought through when they were listing the information very thoroughly about the areas that are critically important. So just to remain objective, we thought, otherwise somebody can question us, why didn't you include this part? So now we are looking at overall. Maybe Shannon can clarify. I think Ministry of Agriculture came up overall disclosure, not just project disclosure. Am I correct?
Overall, thank you. It was overall composite score. So that's not just for project information, but overall.
Yes, I think sometimes it was a bit confusing because we presented infrastructure watch that looks exclusively on projects, and then ministry ranking was done overall disclosure of all the proactive disclosure requirements listed under Regulation 20. So maybe I was thinking Sankita can also talk about the Section 30 and right to reasoning. And if there's anything, Nishana, Shannon, feel free to add.
Yeah, so the right to reasons comes up both in Section 35 and also in Regulation 20. In Section 35, what it says is when a public authority makes a decision about a particular citizen, then the citizen can request and obtain reasons for the decision. So there, what's foreseen is not quite proactive disclosure. There needs to be a request made in that regard. However, what you're saying is also encapsulated in Regulation 20, where it actually, the language says decision making and public participation. So information on decision making procedures, including mechanisms for consultations and public participation in decision making. So this, I can give a good example, right? When we talk about procurement, in Sri Lanka, we know that Cabinet has a lot of discretion over the issue of procurement. However, only Cabinet decisions are made public, and when you speak from experience, when you speak to investigative journalists, we know that we don't know all of the decisions that are made by our Cabinet, supposedly in the public interest. So a lot of decisions are made behind closed doors. And even where a decision is made public, it's only a summary decision that is made public. So there is no serial numbering of Cabinet decisions. So we don't know that decisions have been made. We don't know what decisions have been made. And we don't know what process has been followed in that regard. So it's absolutely crucial that we build that into the proactive disclosure aspect of right to information, and the provisions already exist for that, right? The proactive disclosure provisions, I made this remark in passing, the proactive disclosure provisions in our law are positively utopian, right? So I'd only urge you to look at subsection 3 of regulation 4 of regulation 20, and I think more and more of us need to start using this. That is, we think that proactive disclosure is optional. Yes, it's in the law. Yes, it's required, but we feel like there's no way for us as citizens to enforce it. However, if a citizen finds that a proactive disclosure requirement has not been complied with, there's a remedy that is built into the regulations. That is that they can make a complaint in that regard to the Right to Information Commission, and then the Commission can direct action, direct that particular public authority to take action. So that provision is there, and I think we've given enough time now from a demand and kind of rights-based perspective. It's been 6 years since the Right to Information Act was actually operationalized. So I think it's high time we start, pushing for it on that end also. So this means advocacy on the parts of citizens with the Commission and with relevant public authorities to push for proactive disclosure. Now, I know it's a little ironic because you're requesting proactive disclosure, but and that's not necessarily how it's supposed to work, but I think it's still worth doing. Those of us who have the privilege, the time, the knowledge to be able to do that, and when we speak to citizens as well, to encourage everybody to start pushing for proactive disclosure, because it acts in the public interest at the end of the day. If information is available, it's available not just to you, but to everyone else as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Sankita. Additional Secretary Vijayanaka මම හිතන්නේ අපි අර translation පැත්තෙන් AI technology පාවිච්චි කරන එක ගැන කල්පනා කරන එක මම හිතන්නේ රජයේ පැත්තෙන් අදහසක් කියන්න පුළුවන් නම් කැමතියි දැනගන්න. ඒ වගේම තමයි Kumar, anything on social media and journalism, right? So maybe it's very relevant to journalists also in traditional media, how social media is becoming so much more important, and whether you have any comments in response to that.
තොරතුරු පනත යටතේ තොරතුරු ලබා දීමේදී පමණක් නෙවෙයි රජයේ වෙනත් කටයුතු වලදීත් අපිට ට්‍රාන්ස්ලේෂන් කියන එක ඉතාමත් වැදගත් වෙනවා. නමුත් AI භාවිතා කරනවාද කොහොමද කියන එක ලීගලිම එන්න ඕන දෙයක්. මොකද ඒක ඇක්සෙප්ට් කරන කොයි මට්ටමටද ඇක්සෙප්ට් කරන්නේ. ඒක ඒ වගේම මේකේ ලීගල් බෑග්ග්‍රවුන්ඩ් එක පිළිබඳ අපි යම් අවධානයක් යොමු කරන්න ඕන. මොකද අපිට ඒ කියන්නේ තොරතුරු පනතේ යටතේ ප්‍රොඇක්ටිව් ඩිස්ක්ලෝසර් හෝ ඒ තොරතුරු ලබා දීමේදී මේක මොකක් හරි වැරදක් වුණොත් ඒක අපිට කරගන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ වුණාට රාජ්‍ය පැත්තෙන්ම අපි මේ පිළිබඳ සංවාදයක් ඇති කරලා කොහොමද මේකේ අපි දැන් කැබිනට් පේපර්ස් ට්‍රාන්ස්ලේට් කරනවා, වෙනත් ඩොකියුමන්ට් ට්‍රාන්ස්ලේට් කරනවා. මේ හැම එකටම කොහොමද අපි AI යොදාගන්නේ කියන එක පිළිබඳව අපි එකගතාවයක් අමාත්‍යාංශ මට්ටමින් කතා කරලා මේක ඇති කරලා තුල මොකද මේකට භාවිතා කරන ප්‍රථම මම හිතුවා ප්‍රධානම බාධාව මේ ට්‍රාන්ස්ලේෂන් කියන එක නෙවෙයි. අපේ ප්‍රයොරිටි වල අපේ ප්‍රමුඛතාවවල මේක තියෙනවද නැද්ද කියන එක. එතකොට ඒ අමාත්‍යාංශවල ඇත්තටම අපි ටාගට් එකකට බොහෝ අමාත්‍යාංශවල ටාගට් ඇක්ෂන් ප්ලෑන් එකකට වැඩ කරන්නේ. එතකොට ප්‍රධානම ටාගට් එක වෙන්නේ මෙන්න මේ KPIs කොහොමද ඇචීව් කරන්නේ, performance කොහොමද මේ ලබා ගන්න කියන එක තමයි. එතකොට මේ තොරතුරු පනතින් මේක මහජනතාව තොරතුරු දුන්නම ඒක මිෂර් කරන්න අපේ KPIs වල බොහෝ දුරට නැහැ. ඒ නිසා ඒ වගේම මේ ලබා දෙන ආයතන එන්කරේජ් කරලා දැන් ඔබ එන්කරේජ් කරා ඇග්‍රිකල්චර් මිනිස්ට්‍රිය ෆස්ට් මේකේ කියලා. නමුත් අපි මෙතන මෙන්ෂන් කරන විතරයි. ඒ පිළිබඳ අපි ඇගීමක් කොහොමද කරන්නේ? මම හිතන්නේ මේක නීතියකින්ම කරන්න පුළුවන් කාර්යයක් නෙවෙයි. ඒ වගේම අර කිව්වා වගේ මහජනතාවටත් පුළුවන්. ඒ කියන්නේ අපේ මේක බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන අයට මේ පිළිබඳ තොරතුරු අපිට ලැබුණේ නැහැ. ඒ විදිහට යම් යම් ක්‍රියාමාර්ග ගැනීමෙන් ඒ පිළිබඳ අපේ සමාජයට ප්‍රමුඛතා වෙනස් කිරීමට ඒ කාර්යයක් හේතුවක් වෙනවා. ඒ නිසා මේ පිළිබඳ ඇත්තටම රාජ්‍ය පරිපාලන අමාත්‍යාංශත් අනිත් අමාත්‍යාංශත් විශේෂයෙන් සියලුම අමාත්‍යාංශ තුළ මේ AI වලින් කොහොමද අපි මේ ඇත්තටම ලබා දෙන්න පුළුවන්. ලබා දෙන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි ඒකේ නීතිමය තත්ත්වය පිළිබඳ අපි අවධානය යොමු කරන්න ඕනේ. ඒ පිළිබඳ කල්පනා කරන්න.
මම හිතන්නේ අර මේ තොරතුරු දැනගැනීමේ ප්‍රමුඛත්වය කියන එක මම විශේෂයෙන් එක උදාහරණයක් වොත් මම පෞද්ගලික අංශයක ගොඩක් වැඩ කරන හින්දා විශේෂයෙන් අර මහත්මයෙක් ඇහුවා ඩිමාන්ඩ් කරන තොරතුරු දැන් අපි එක රිසර්ච් එකක් කළා පෞද්ගලික අංශයේ විශේෂයෙන්ම ඉල්ලන ඉතාමත්ම බේසික් ඉන්ෆර්මේෂන් ඇවිල්ලා මට මොකක් හරි විශේෂයෙන්ම අපනයන සම්බන්ධයෙන් කළේ අපනයනය කරනවා නම් මට ගන්න ඕනේ පර්මිට් මොනවාද අප්‍රූවල් මොනවාද මම සබ්මිට් කරන්න ඕනේ ඩොකියුමන්ට්ස් මොනවාද කාටද සබ්මිට් කරන්න ඕනේ කොච්චර කාලයක් යනවාද මගේ අප්‍රූවල් එක ගන්න මට අපීල් ප්‍රොසීඩියර් එකක් තියනවාද ෆීස් කොච්චරද කවුද කතා ඇත්තටම මේ තාමත්ම බේසික් ඉන්ෆර්මේෂන් අපි විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ ඇග්‍රිකල්චර් ප්‍රොඩක්ට්ස් එක්ස්පෝර්ට් කරන ඉන්ස්ටිටියුෂන්ස් වල වෙබ්සයිට් වල චෙක් කළාම ඇත්තටම ඉංග්‍රීසියෙන් වුණත් ඇක්සස් කරන්න පුළුවන් ඔක්කොම ඉන්ෆර්මේෂන් ඒ කියන්නේ ඇප්ලිකේෂන් ෆෝම් එක ඩොකියුමන්ට් සබ්මිට් කරන එක ඩිසිෂන් ඒවා ඔක්කොම 30ක් වගේ තමයි ඔක්කොම ඉන්ෆර්මේෂන් ඉංග්‍රීසි වලින් තිබෙනවා. අනික මේක තමයි විශේෂයෙන් සිංහල සහ දෙමළ කියන එක වැදගත්. මොකද අපි දිරිගන්වන්න ඕනේ ව්‍යාපාරිකයන් අපනයන විශේෂයෙන් වර්තමානය ගැන හිතනකොට. ඉතින් මම හිතන්නේ සිංහලෙන් සහ දෙමළෙන් තිබීමත් ඉතාමත්ම වැදගත් ව්‍යාපාරිකයන්ට. අනික මම හිතන්නේ රාජ්‍ය ආයතනයේ පැත්තෙන්මුත් නිරන්තරයෙන් 100 දෙනෙක් කතා කරලා ඉන්ෆර්මේෂන් එක අහනවට වැඩිය ඒක වෙබ්සයිට් එකේ තියෙනකොට මම හිතන්නේ ආයතනයේ නිලධාරීන්ටත් ඒක පහසුවක් වෙනවා. ඉතින් ඒක නිසා මේ වගේ බේසික් ඉන්ෆර්මේෂන් දෙන එක රටේ ගොඩක් වෙලාවට වැදගත් වෙනවා.
අනිවාර්යංගයක් ඇත්තටම මහජන සේවා සැපයීමේ ප්‍රමුඛ කාර්යයක් වෙන්නේ අපිට බොහෝ දුරට ඇප්ලිකේෂන් ෆෝමැට්ස් ඒවා අනිවාර්යෙන් in Sinhala and Tamil languages available in these languages. That we have to disclose this information in website or any other formats, electronic formats.
Kumar, do you have any response to social media? If not, we can continue as well. So.
Thank you, Subhashini. I think before I answer that, I also want to mention, like, I think what the assistant additional director said also here is that the willpower to do it, right? It's the willpower. Sometimes, see, today we talk about Zoom, we talk about Teams, we talk about how we adapted virtual meetings and web conferencing. That was there from late 90s. When, I can talk about it because I was one of the guys who was trying to evangelize that we need to use virtual meetings, but people didn't pick it up. You need to be under closed doors, get into a COVID, and then now, like, you can't get people to come for meetings, right? Because we got adapted, right? We adopted and we adapted. Right, I think it's the same thing that applies here also. Like, I think we're looking at, like, we look at this as a very challenging thing of trying to get the data out there. But I think today we have the tools, the technology. Like, if you take Coca-Cola or if you take PepsiCo, they run multi-billion-dollar organizations where the CEO, right, is able to have the information at the fingertip, right? Why? Because they got the data architecture, right? They got the data architecture, they basically got themselves present. So I think we need to go to the drawing board, and I would say like we should at least, I would kind of say like the nodal ministry should at least try to see if we can get in at least some of the key ministries, work this out so that we have the systems that we can bring it in. It's just that we need to bring it in. Like the nodal ministry should be kind of pushing it, working with the Ministry of Public Administration to get this going so that the technology is there. Right, it's about getting into our systems. I mean, as you were saying. So I think that's where I think like we need to. It boils down to that piece of the willpower to do it and the willingness to do it. Going back to Lakshman's question, I think we had constant confrontation. We never bashed at each other on this, but yes. So social media and the mainstream media. Yes, we always feel that okay, look, social media is there. It's going to take over the mainstream media. But I strongly believe like good journalism will prevail, right? I strongly feel, because when social media came in, citizen journalism came in, like people were talking about, like, this is the way to go, this is how it's going. But today I'll go back to the same point that I made in regard to false information, mis and disinformation. Today you have the same technology being used, same platform being used, and the algorithms work in different ways. Right. Today we talk, I mean, as a group, as a community here, we might talk about one subject because we seek for particular information. And when we seek for particular information, the algorithm picks that and gives you that information. And we think, wow, this is great. But then there's another group of people who are seeking different information, and that they're being fed with different information, right? And you guys have all tested it. You go to YouTube and you pick one information that is outside your journal, and then you find like suddenly you get complete set of information that's coming in. So it's again, I feel like whether it's going to be the social media, whether it's going to be the mainstream media, but I think what is more important is to build a critical thinking among our public, right? What they consume, whether it's social media or mainstream media. But I strongly believe like at the moment, it seems to be like a gray area, one is overtaking the other, but eventually we will come to a point where we would really want to have the right information and whether it's the correct information. So good journalism, I believe, will always prevail. So social media, yes. Social media and mainstream media should look at each other as complementary, right? They should see it complementary. One should give a lead to the other to further drill down into other these things. So that's how I would see social media and mainstream media. Sorry, Lakshman, I know this is not what you wanted to hear, but...
Yes. Yeah. I think what's really what Kumar said was very important. It's about adapting technology. So I can remember during COVID, we had to do a survey and we had to do key informant meetings and we had to interview so many senior government officials. And initially I was hesitant. I wasn't sure, because you always feel government is rather slow to adopt technology. But it was like exactly like you said, when there is a need, when there is a will, all the 10 government officials that we had to interview was readily available online, and it was very impressive. So you could see that government is able to embrace technology, use technology, and they're capable of it. So maybe AI one day will be coming that way as well. So any other questions from the audience? Yes. Can we have a mic here? And there is a question over there as well.
Thank you very much. I'm Tushara, by the way, representing Minister of Transport. Thank you very much, Verite. We always get criticisms, but hardly get pat on our back. So thank you. We were 9th, I believe. So I'm asked to hear that as well. I have 2 questions. Hi, Kumar. I have 2 questions, but let me tell something as well. I tend to strongly agree with my colleague Kalum. If you think, the panel or the audience, that we are biased towards language, no way, no. We are not. It's the lack of resources that we have. Everywhere I go, I work. I wanted to do more. I want to do trilingual in my website. I want to write articles. I want to publish everything that we do. But I couldn't get those done because we in the government sector, we don't have a marketing arm. We work. We don't market ourselves. And we don't have marketing budget. And even though we want to do more, we lack resources. So it comes as a priority, and then the other things comes on top of those, and it goes down. That's what happened to us. So what I'm requesting from the stakeholders like you that you come forward on behalf of us to tell the others what we do. If you could help us to be a pressure group for us to convince the government, the coffin, to give us something for us to, blow our own trumpet. That would help us, because we hardly don't have anything. Sometimes we try to get the services from the government sector itself, they are not capable of. But if you want to get the people who can do things, they're costly. So you don't have the luxury of spending those money. So that's the sad part, as you said, from the government sector. The two questions to Kumar. Once I invited one of the press friend to write something for me, and he sent a person. And I told my story to him. I said, please do share with me the story, because I want to make sure you are writing what I wanted to tell the country. Then he has given the story to some other person to rewrite it, and I believe he had one of his thoughts also, and the story came back to me. It's totally different from what I told him. So I said, no, please don't publish. So he said, today is Friday, it has to go on Sunday, you need to give me the answer. I said, please don't. If you publish this, there will be lots of other issues coming up. So I made sure that it didn't publish, because it's not the thing that I wanted. So that shows the lack or the sad part that we are in. We wanted to tell, but there's no resource. So don't you think, even though we wanted to disclose proactively, from the press, from the media, you have enough people who could do a story with the right spirit. So that's something that I want to hear from you. The other one is, now we talk about output and we analyze the outcome. So if the surveys also could have something related to the inputs, okay, in order to get this output, do this ministry, do this department has the necessary resources to do so? So I propose, if you can have that, so, it'll be a balance, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think maybe just Kumar can definitely add to that. Maybe we can, there was another question there, maybe we can get that as well.
Thank you. I'm Ashwini Natesan. I'm an independent researcher on focusing on right to information. I think this is a great study and one that we have used widely even in the past. My question is essentially one question and one clarification regarding the research. The first being, one is essentially a question and one is more like a clarification, I would say, two clarifications. The first is, in your study from 2017 to the one that you have done now, have you seen any marked difference of a particular public authority who did not perform well but has performed very well in this particular study that you would like to highlight? Or if you see that that's not the case, that's also fine. That's one. The other clarificatory ones that I want to check regarding the research is, when you looked at the infrastructure watch, you looked at about 60 projects you had mentioned. Were these select projects, or were these the only projects that were conducted during this time span? Were these the only available projects and you looked at all of them? That's the clarification. And the next clarification is on your assessment of language bias. Can you throw some light on language bias and how it was assessed, please? For example, what I want to know is, would you look at whether the same details available in English were also available in Sinhala and Tamil? Is that the case? Or did you have a different weightage for certain criteria? Maybe the important ones were available, so they still got a better score than someone else who probably had 5 out of 10 information being made available in the other languages, but still got a lesser score because they were not critical. So I'm just trying to see how you had your language bias assessed. Those are the two clarifications. And perhaps just one other thing that I would like to get clarified is on the projects that you assessed in the infrastructure watch. Any particular findings that you think were glaring and essential that were not sort of given here? Because in your assessment criteria, the first one was project details. That was the score for the basis. So what exactly is project details? Is it just the name of the project or what's included in that? Those were my questions. On the research, I have no questions from the panel. Thank you.
So maybe we have room for one more question. We are running out of time, but yes, please go ahead.
සුබ සන්ධ්‍යාවක් සියලු දෙනාටම මම පියංකර ජාතික දීවර සහගත ව්‍යාපාරයේ නියෝජනය කරන්නේ. මම හිතන්නේ මේ කාරණාව පල්ලෙහාට ගෙනියද්දී අපි දකින ප්‍රධාන එක කාරණාවක් තමයි ජනතාව මේකට සූදානම්ද කියන එක. මේ තොරතුරු දැන ගැනීම සඳහා ජනතාවට සූදානම්ද මෙයාලා කියන එක. අනිත් එක මේ වෙලාවේ ජනතාව තොරතුරු දැනගත්තයි කියලා ඇති වැඩක් තියනවද කියන ප්‍රශ්නේ අහනවා අපි. මොකද තොරතුරු දැනගත්තයි කියලා කණ්ඩද කියලා අහන්නේ. මොකද දැන් ලොකු ඒ ප්‍රශ්නේ මම හිතන්නේ එක පැත්තකින් අපි මෙතඩොලොජි කියන්නේ ස්ට්‍රැටජිස් මම හිතන්නේ අපිට වෙනස් කරන්න වෙයි ඉස්සරහට මේ ජනතාව ළඟට යනකොට. මොකද අර සාමාන්‍ය අපි පහුගිය අවුරුදු 2015 ඉඳලා මේ වෙනකන් අපි තොරතුරු දැන ගැනීම පිළිබඳව දැනුවත් කරද්දී ඒ වෙලාවේ පුදුමාකාර ඉන්ට්‍රස්ට් එකක් තිබුණේ. දැම්ම පුළුවන් තරම් තොරතුරු ඉල්ලුවා. හැබැයි පළවෙනි පේපර් එකෙන්ම නතර වෙනවා. මොකද ජනතාව එතනින් එහාට යන්නේ නැහැ. මොකද තොරතුරු දුන්නේ නැති ගමන්ම දෙවෙනි එකට යන්නේ නැහැ. දෙවෙනි පියවරට යන්නේ නැහැ. හැබැයි ගිහිල්ලා අවසානයේ කමිෂන් එකටත් ගියාට පස්සේ සමහරක් කාට ඒවට උත්තර හම්බෙන්නේ නැතුව ගියාම එහෙම නතර වෙනවා. ඉතින් ආයතන එක්ක බද්ධ වෙලා කරන අය ඒක දුරට අරන් යනවා. නමුත් ජනතාව විදියට ඒක ගෙනියන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ නිසා මේ රිසර්ච් එක තුල මම කියන්නේ ජනතාව කොහොමද මේක ඇතුලේ මොබිලයිස් කරන්න කියන එක පිළිබඳව මම හිතන්නේ මේට වඩා අපි හිතුවද එහෙම නැත්නම් හිතලා තියනවද කියන එක අපිට එක පැත්තකින් ගන්න වෙනවා. එක කාරණාවක් විදිහට. දෙවෙනි එක තමයි දැන් මේ රාජ්‍යතාන්ත්‍රික පිරිස ගත්තාම වරදවා හිතන්න එපා කවුරුත් මට හරි දුක හිතෙනවා මේ තාක්ෂණය ඇත්තටම අඩුම ගානේ මේ රාජ්‍ය නිලධාරීන් ඇයි භාවිතා කරන්නේ නැත්තේ කියන එක. ප්‍රාදේශීය ලේකම් කාර්යාලයක් ගත්තොත් අපි ගිහිලා තොරතුරු ටිකක් අහන්න ගියාම WhatsApp එකක්වත් හරියට යූස් කරන්නේ නැහැ. අඩුම ගානේ මේ මිනිස්සුත් එක්ක පොඩි කමියුනිකේෂන් එකක් තියාගන්න. මම කියන්නේ උදාම පහළ මට්ටමින් තියෙන. මම හිතන්නේ මේක අපේ අමාත්‍යාංශ වලට පුන අපිට කියන්න පුළුවන් නම් නීතිමය වශයෙන් මේට වඩා මේවා තොරතුරු බෙදා හැරීම සඳහා ඒ අයව කොහොමද අපි අවෑනස් කරන්න කියන එක. අපිට සිවිල් සංවිධාන නීතියට මේක කරන්න පුළුවන්කමක් තියෙනවා කියලා මම විශ්වාස කරන්නේ මහා ලොකුවට. නමුත් ට්‍රාන්ස්පරන්ට් ඉන්ටර්නැෂනල් එක වගේ ගෙනිච්ච විශාල වැඩපිළිවෙලක් අපි දන්නවා එක අබද්ධ වෙලා කරපු වැඩපිළිවෙල රාජ්‍ය නිලධාරීන් දැනුවත් කිරීම වැඩසටහන. අපි ඕන තරම් කරුවා ඒ කාලේ. හැබැයි එතනින් එහාට ඉවරයි. ගොඩක් වෙලාවට භාවිතය ඇත්තටම මේට වඩා කොහොමද කරවගන්නේ කියන අර ප්‍රෙෂර් ගෲප් එකක් හදන්න කිව්වනේ. මම කියන්නේ එහෙම වැඩකට අපිට යන්න සිදු වෙලා තියෙනවා ඉස්සරහට මේක තව ශක්තිමත් කරන්න ඕන නම්. මම කියන්නේ ඒක තමයි අපේ කාර්යය වෙන්න ඕනේ. ඒ නිසා මම හිතනවා වෙරිටි එකට කොහොමත් අපි ස්තුති කරනවා. අපි ගොඩාක් සහයෝගය ගන්න ඒ වගේම තොරතුරු භාවිතා කරන්න උත්සාහ කරනවා. උලුවන් තරම් මේවා ප්‍රචාරය කරන ජනතාව අතරට ගෙනියනවා. මේක තවදුරටත් ගෙනියන්න නම් ඇත්තට මේ අනෙකුත් අංශවල මේක භාවිතය පිළිබඳව මේට වඩා විධික්‍රම අපි කල්පනා කරමු කියන යෝජනාව තමයි මම කියන්නේ. මම ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෙමෙයි ඇත්තටම ඒක ඉදිරිපත් කිරීමක් කරේ.
Thank you, Priyankara. So I'll first quickly add to one point that was raised by the Ministry of Transport. I think personally I feel maybe Kumar and the Additional Secretary can correct. So I feel that one of the surest way to challenge misinformation and disinformation carried by media is actually officially releasing documented information on the website. So I would say the safest way is when you give some information to media to ensure that it is documented and available on the website. Then even if the journalist reports the wrong information, then you have a safeguard to say, look, you know, it is already available. This is exactly what I said. So I personally felt proactive disclosure online is one way to safeguard public officials from being misquoted and reported by media, because if it's documented and available on the ministry website, then that provides you a safeguard. Maybe Kumar can add anything on that, Kumar?
Yeah, I think in the first place, like, I'm sorry that you had a bad experience, and definitely, I think, like, I don't want to deny. I mean, these things have happened, and I believe, like, the newsrooms are also having their challenges in regard to retaining journalists and then moving on so on. But I mean, technically, it should not have happened because, like, if you had given an information, they should have clarified and they should have actually gone on to publish it, as you said. So this is something that is unfortunate, right? But I think definitely, like, I mean, it's a nice hint that Subhashini also gave, like, okay, you publish on the website, but then I would say, like, okay, as a good journalist, like, I mean, they should have actually gone with the right information. And you also find, like, that a journalist, like, if you get hold of the right people, they would actually have the right information going out. So I do not know what type of information it was, but there's always the balance, the both sides to the information has been also looked from the journalist. But in this case, it's unfortunate, but I think this is a good thing that we're like a documented information, something that is data that goes on, is something that's important because when it moves from one person to another, like, we do not know how it's getting communicated. So it's unfortunate, but definitely don't give up hope. Do talk to the journalists, do talk to the media because there are good journalists, there are good newsrooms that are publishing it. So we can work it out, yes.
And Shannon, there was a question about whether there were any ministries with marked improvements, if you can provide.
Yes, Ashwini. So to answer your question, the ministry that I would like to congratulate for extreme improvement is the Ministry of Ports. So in 2017, the Ministry of Ports was in the bottom 15, but this year we see them in the top 10. So that's a massive improvement. Ashwini, to answer your other question on how we assess language bias, so what we looked at is whether information, if it was available in English, was it also available in Sinhala and Tamil. So we didn't put weight on some information being more important than others. It was assessed equally, I would say, across all.
And then Chatuni, there was a question. Yes, please.
ස්තුති තුෂාර ප්‍රතිපාදන පිළිබඳ ඇත්තටම ප්‍රශ්නේ මුතු කරාට ඇත්තටම අපේ තොරතුරු ලබා දීමේදී මම ඒක තමයි කිව්වේ ප්‍රයොරිටි එක. ඇත්තටම පහුගිය අවුරුදු 2015 මේ තොරතුරු පන්ත පටන් ගත්ත දවසේ ඉඳලා ඇත්තට මාස් මීඩියා මිනිස්ට්‍රි එකටත් විශාල ප්‍රතිපාදන ප්‍රමාණයක් ලැබුණේ නිසා ගොඩක් ප්‍රෝග්‍රෑම්ස් කරා. නමුත් දැන් අපිට සිදු වෙලා තියෙනවා UNDP එක හරි වෙන ආයතන හරි එක කොලැබොරේටිව්ලි මේ යම් වැඩසටහන් කරන්න. නමුත් අපි මේ අවස්ථාවේ මම හිතන්නේ ප්‍රතිපාදන පිළිබඳ අපි වෙනමම අපේ රජයේ නිලධාරීන්ගේ ප්ලැට්ෆෝම් එක කතා කර යුතුයි. ඒ වගේම අර මට නම මතක නැහැ. ඔව් මහත්මයා කිව්ව විදියට ඇත්තටම අපි නව තාක්ෂණය සහ ඒ වයින් තොරතුරු ලබා දීම පිළිබඳ ඒ තත්ත්වයට යන්න ඕන. මම හිතන්නේ ඒ වගේ ඩ්‍රෝබැක් තියෙනවද කියලා මම දන්න තරමින් නම් සමහර ප්‍රාදේශීය ලේකම් කාර්යාල ඒ තත්ත්වයට ගිහිල්ලා තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම WhatsApp වලින් තොරතුරු ඉල්ලුවොත් නම්බර් එකත් එක්ක දෙන්නේ නැති ආයතන තියෙනවද කියලා මටත් ඇති. නමුත් මං හිතන්නේ ඒක සරලව දෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒක පිළිබඳ ආයතනටත් ලේසි. මොකද තොරතුරු ඒ කියන්නේ අපේ තියෙන තොරතුරක් WhatsApp වලින් WhatsApp නම්බර් එක එව්වම ඒ තත්ත්වෙට නම් අපේ ආයතන මං හිතන්නේ අනිවාර්යෙන් මේ වෙන්න ඕන. එහෙම හැබැයි ඒ මට්ටමින් ඉල්ලන්නත් දැන් බොහෝ දුරට තොරතුරු ඉල්ලන්නේ ඇත්තටම මේ මතම ඉඳලා මේ තොරතුරු අවශ්‍ය වෙ ඉල්ලන්නේ බොහෝ දුරට ආයතන organizations සිවිල් සමාජය මිනිසුන් ඒ වගේ ඉල්ලන අවස්ථා අපි මං හිතන්නේ තොරතුරු විශ්ලේෂණය කරොත් මං හිතන්නේ ඒක පිටද රිසර්ච් එකක් කරලා නැතුව ඇති. නමුත් ඊටමත් අඩුයි. ඒ වගේම අර කිව් විදියට සමහර තොරතුරු නොදුන්නා මෙතන අධ්‍යාර වෙලා ඒක යනවා. ඒ නිසා මේක සිවිල් සොසයිටි එකයි ගවර්න්මන්ට් එකයි මේක දෙගොල්ලගේම වගකීමක් වෙනවා මේ තොරතුරු පන්ති අදාළ තොරතුරු ගන්න කොහොමද කියන එක සහ ඩිමාන්ඩ් කියන එක ඉතාම වැදගත්. එතකොට මේ ඩිමාන්ඩ් එක තියෙන්නේ යම්කිසි පෞද්ගලික අරමුණක් සඳහා නෙමෙයි පොදු යහපත නම් තමන්ගේ යහපත නම් ඉතාම වැදගත්. මම හිතන්නේ ඒක නිසා මේ අවයානස් කියන එක ඉතාම වැදගත්. ඒ වගේම එන්කරේජ්මන්ට් කියන එක ඉතාම වැදගත්. ඒ වගේම ඉන්සෙන්ටිව්ස් ඒ කියන්නේ ඒක ඉතාමත් වැදගත් මේ තොරතුරු පනත සහ ප්‍රොඇක්ටිව් ඩිස්ක්ලෝසර් කියන එකට ඉතාම වැදගත්. ඒ වගේම මිස්ඉන්ෆෝමේෂන් සහ ඩිස්ඉන්ෆෝමේෂන් සිදුවීමේ හැකියාව අවම කරනවා ප්‍රොඇක්ටිව් ඩිස්ක්ලෝසර් මගින්. ප්‍රෝග්‍රාමී තොරතුරු ලබා දීම මගින්. ඒ නිසා අපි යම් දුර්වලතාවයක් තිබුණත් ඒවා අපි අපේ සියලුම රජ්‍ය ආයතන සදාගත යුතු වෙනවා. අපිට හැකිපමණ තාක්ෂණය භාවිතා කළ මේ තොරතුරු දෙන්න. ඒ අය ගැන මම කිව්වේ ඒක කොහොමද අපි දැන් ડોකියුමන්ට් එකක් දැන්ට ට්‍රාන්ස්ලේට් කරොත් අපි සර්ටිෆිකේෂන් එකක් ගන්නවා ට්‍රාන්ස්ලේටර්ගෙන්. මේක කොහොමද ඒක ලීගලයිස් කරන්නේ මේ AI වලින් ටෙක්නොලොජි අපිට කරන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ පිළිබඳ සංවාදයක් ඇති කරලා ඒ පිළිබඳ එකගතාවයක් ඇති විය යුතුයි මේ තොරතුරු දෙන එකට. ඒ ඇරෙන්න අපිට නව තාක්ෂණයේ WhatsApp ඒ වගේ අපිට ඒ තොරතුරු මම හිතන්නේ රාජ්‍ය ආයතන එහෙම ඉල්ලනවා නම් අපිට ලබා දිය හැකියි. මම හිතන්නේ
Mr. Dimahitane, Chatni, you can maybe provide that clarification how you selected the 60 projects and also what is included in project details.
Yeah. So Ashwini, to answer your question about how we selected the projects, so the guidelines under section 9(1)(b) kind of lays out that proactive disclosure of information should be provided for locally funded projects over a particular level of total estimated cost, and this is the same for foreign funded projects as well. So when we looked at projects over this threshold. And then, so it wasn't necessarily the only projects that were implemented during this period. We also looked at projects. And then we selected projects based on the highest total estimated cost. And when it comes to project details, that particular category kind of has information points about project description, implementing agency, execution agency, so the very basic project information.
Yes, so it was shortlisting, so we decided to go with 60 and we shortlisted them after ranking from highest to lowest, the value-wise. And the 60 was selected as the highest value projects. And yes, project details also include beneficiaries, the project objective, so the basic details of why the project is being done, who is the executing agency, who are the beneficiaries, that kind of information, where is the location, that basic information is included in the project details. And I think I'm sure Sankita has a lot to comment on encouraging people to ask for information. Maybe Priyanka අර සංකිතා කලිනුත් කිව්වා වගේ ඔයාගේ ප්‍රශ්නට හොඳම උත්තරේ proactive disclosure encourage කරන එක. මොකද ගොඩක් වෙලාවට මිනිස්සු එකක් තමයි බය නිසා, විශේෂයෙන් මම පෞද්ගලික අංශයක වැඩ කරන නිසා පෞද්ගලික අංශයේ බොහෝ නිලධාරීන් ඉතාමත්ම අකමැති information request කරන්න ඒගොල්ලන් එදිනෙදා ගනුදෙනු කරන ආයතනවල. මොකද ඒ නිලධාරීන්ට පුළුවන් ඒ information ඉල්ලපුවාම ඒගොල්ලන් කියන්නේ අනිත් පැත්තට information ඉල්ලපුවාම ඒගොල්ලන් එක personally ගන්නවා, ඊට පස්සේ permit එක ඉල්ලන්න issue කරන්න ගියාම ඒගොල්ලන්ව harass කරනවා. ඒ වගේ බය නිසා ඒගොල්ලන් information ඉල්ලන්නේ නැහැ. ඉතින් ඒක නිසා තමයි මම හිතන්නේ proactive disclosure කියන එක සංකිතා කිව්වා වගේ මේ වර්තමාන පරිසරය තුල ඉතාමත්ම වැදගත්. ජනතාවගේ පැත්තෙනුත් maybe සංකිතා you have something to add to that.
ඇත්තටම අර මේ අහපු ප්‍රශ්නේ තොරතුරු කන්නද කියන එකනේ. මං හිතන්නේ තොරතුරු ඉල්ලුම් පත්‍රයක් කවුරු හරි පාවිච්චි කරාට පස්සේ ඇත්තටම තේරෙනවා ඒක කොච්චර බලයක් තියනවද කියන එක. ඉතින් ඕනම ප්‍රජාවකට අපි මේක ගැන කතා කරනකොට මං හිතන්නේ දිරිගැන්වීමක් කරන්න ඕන එක තොරතුරු ඉල්ලුම් පත්‍රයක්වත් යොමු කරන්න. මං හිතන්නේ මෙතනදී අපි ප්‍රගාමී හෙළිදරව් ගැන නෙවෙයි කතා කරන්නේ. දැන් මේ ප්‍රතිචාර වශයෙන් ඒ කියන්නේ ඉල්ලා ලබා ගන්න තොරතුරු ඇත්තටම එහෙම තොරතුරක් ගන්න ලැබිච්ච අවස්ථාවකදී හෝ නැත්නම් ප්‍රතික්ෂේප වුණාම ඒකට අභ්‍යාචනාවක් කළා ඒකේ ප්‍රතිඵලයක් විදියට තොරතුරක් ලැබුණම ඇත්තටම අපේ රටම ගැන සහ අපි ඉන්න සමාජය ගැන අපේ තියෙන මේ අපේ බලන කෝණය ඇත්තටම වෙනස් වීමක් වෙනවා. ඒක මටත් සිද්ධ වෙලා තියෙනවා. මම හිතන්නේ මේ අයිතිය පාවිච්චි කරපු ගොඩක් අයට වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් ඒ වගේ තොරතුරු ඉල්ලීමක් කරන්න දිරිගැන්වීම කරන්න අවශ්‍යයි. ඒක කරනකොට තව අංග දෙකක් තියෙනවා. එකක් තමයි ප්‍රජාවට අදාළ දෙයක් අහනවා නම් මං හිතන්නේ එක පුද්ගලයෙක්ට නෙවෙයි ප්‍රජාවටම වාසියක් වෙන වැදගත් වෙන ප්‍රයෝජනවත් වෙන ප්‍රතිඵලයක් ලබා ගන්න පුළුවන්. එතකොට ඒ තුලින් ඒ ප්‍රජාවම මේ තොරතුරු ඉල්ලන්නන් තොරතුරු භාවිතා කරන්නන් බවට පරිවර්තනය කරන්න පුළුවන්. මං උදාහරණයක් කියන්නම්. අපි දකුණු පළාතේ වැඩ කරනවා. අපේ ආයතනය මට මතකයි අපි හම්බන්තොට කණ්ඩායම් දෙකක් එක්ක මේ සම්බන්ධයෙන් දැනුවත් කිරීම කරලා ඒ කට්ටියම එක එක තැන් වලින් එකට ගෙන ආපු අවස්ථාවකදී එක කණ්ඩායමක් කිව්වා මේ අපි මෙහෙම අපේ ප්‍රදේශයේ ජල නැති ප්‍රශ්න ගැන තොරතුරු ඉල්ලුම් පත්‍රයක් දැම්මා කියලා ඒකේ ප්‍රතිඵලයක් විදියට ජලය ලැබුණා කියලා. ජල සැපයීම ලැබුණා කියලා. එතකොට එතන හිටපු හම්බන්තොටම අනිත් කණ්ඩායම කිව්වා අපි බැලුවා ඇයි හිටපු ගමන් අපිට වතුර එන්න පටන් ගත්තේ කොහොමද කියලා අපි බැලුවා කියලා. ඉතින් ඇත්තටම ඒක අර ප්‍රජාවක් තුල පරිවර්තනයක් ඇති වෙන්න පුළුවන් මේ විසඳුම් වලට යන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි මේ තොරතුරු ඉල්ලනකොට අපිට විසඳුම් බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නත් බෑ හැමතිස්සෙම. අපි හැමතිස්සෙම මුලින් ඉඳන්ම ප්‍රජාව දැනුවත් කිරීමේදී කිව්වේ තොරතුරු ඉල්ලනකොට අපි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්න ඕන තොරතුරු තමයි කියලා. විසඳුම් නෙවෙයි කියලා. හැබැයි ගොඩක් අවස්ථාවලදී තොරතුරු ඉල්ලලා විසඳුම් ලැබිච්ච අවස්ථාවල් තියෙනවා. ඉතින් ඒක පාවිච්චි කරලත් ජනතාව දිරිගැන්වීම කරන්න පුළුවන් තොරතුරු ඉල්ලුම් පත්‍රය යොමු කරන්න. හැබැයි අපේ ආයතනයේ විදියට මම ඒ කියන්නේ ට්‍රෙන්ඩ් එකක් විදියට බලනවා නම් තොරතුරු ඉල්ලලා විසඳුම් ලැබෙනවා නම් මට ඒක ගැන ලොකු සැකයක් තියෙනවා. මොකද තොරතුරු දෙනවට වැඩිය ඒ කියන්නේ තොරතුරු දීමෙන් Tamanට ප්‍රශ්නයක් වෙන්න පුළුවන් මෙතන මොකක් හරි අක්‍රමිකතාවයක් වෙලා තියෙනවා නැත්නම් අඩුම ගානේ අතපසු වීමක් වෙලා තියෙනවා කියන හින්ට් එක තමයි මම හිතන්නේ දෙන්නේ විසඳුම ලබා දීම තුලින්. මොකද විසඳුම ලබා දුන්නාම මගේ බෝක්කුව කැඩලා තියෙනවා. ඒක ගැන ගත්ත මම පැමිණිල්ලක් කරා. ඒ පැමිණිල්ල සම්බන්ධයෙන් ගත්ත පියවර මොනවද කියලා තියෙන ලේඛන දෙන්න කිව්වම බෝක්කුව හැදෙනවා. එතකොට එතන අතපසු වීමක් වෙලා තියෙනවා නැත්තම් අක්‍රමිකතාවයක් වෙලා තියෙනවා කියන එකට පොඩි මේ ඉඟියක් තමයි මම නම් දකින්නේ අපේ ආයතනයේ මේ අල්ලස දූෂණය මේ අකාර්යක්ෂමතාවය දිහා බලන ආයතනයක් විදියට. හැබැයි පුරවැසියන් දිරිගන්වන්න මේ විසඳුම් ලැබීම කියන එකත් එක ගැනත් කතා කරන්න පුළුවන්. මම මේ ඕවරෝල් කමෙන්ට් එකක් පොඩ්ඩක් කියන්නම් මේ ප්‍රගාමී හෙලිදරව්ව ගැන කතා කරනකොට මේ රෙකෝඩ් මැනේජ්මන්ට් කියන එකත් වැදගත් වෙනවා. මේ I'll switch to English, I think it's probably easier. The RTI Act talks about the RTI Commission needing to issue record management guidelines for public authorities to follow. To the best that I can determine, they have given a kind of an overall, and happy to be corrected if there's more updated information about this, but they've given a framework for record management, but I don't think specific guidelines have been issued, but I'm again happy to find out otherwise. But I just wanted to talk about the importance of record management both for proactive and reactive disclosure, because right now the burden is on an information officer to locate the information, classify it according to whether it's disclosable information or not, to then turn it into a soft copy form, to make it proactively available online, and to convert it into other forms to make it proactively available in other ways, or to disclose it reactively. So getting that kind of model ready, I think, is really important when we think about reactive and proactive disclosure. So I think UNDP was doing some work around creating model public authorities, but there's still a lot of potential to go there in terms of record management and information availability. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have almost come to the end of the session. I would like Kumar, Additional Secretary, if you have any final thoughts to add.
කලින් ප්‍රශ්න මතු කරා වගේ ඇත්තටම මේ පිළිබඳ කිපයක් කිව්වා තව තවත් පරීක්ෂණ කටයුතු සිදු කර යුතුයි මොනවද අපි ඒ කියන්නේ වැඩිපුරම ඉල්ලන්නේ කියලා ඒ වගේම මිනිසුන්ගේ අවශ්‍යතාවය මොකක්ද ඒ පිළිබඳ සහ ඒ වගේම වර්තමාන තත්ත්වය සමහරට වෙනස් වෙන්න පුළුවන් කොවිඩ් එක්කත් ඒ වගේම ඉකොනොමික් රිකවරි එකම මේ ඉන්ෆර්මේෂන් සමහර විට වෙනස් වෙන්න පුළුවන් මේ 2022 තොරතුරු 2023 එක්ක so after this year we have to do more research on that ඒ වගේම රාජ්‍ය ආයතන විදියට අපි මේ පිළිබඳ අපේ අවධානය මීට වඩා යොමු කරන්න ඕන. ඒ වගේම අපි මේ පිළිබඳ මොනිටරින් මෙකැනිසම් එකක්. ඒතර මම හිතන තොරතුරු කොමිසමට මේ පුළුවන් මේ මෙකැනිසම් එක හදන්න. මේ ආයතන පිළිබඳ අපි දැනට වාර්ෂිකව මේ වාර්තාව ගන්නවා. ඒ වගේම මේ ප්‍රොඇක්ටිව් ඩිස්ක්ලෝසර් පිළිබඳ මොනිටරින් මෙකැනිසම් එකක් සකස් කළ ක්‍රියාත්මක කර යුතු වෙනවා. එතකොට අපිට මේ මේකට තියෙන ඩ්‍රෝබැක්ස් මොනවද ඒවා ඇචීව් කරන්න ඒ ආයතනවලට අපි උදව් කර යුතු වෙනවා. ඒ පහළ දැන් අපේ මේ ප්‍රගාමී තොතුරු ලබා දීමෙන් පහළ යම් ප්‍රගති අඩු ආයතන වලට යම් මට්ටමින් උදව් කළ යුතු වෙනවා රජයේ ආයතන විදියටත්. ඒ වගේම උට ට්‍රේනින් අවශ්‍ය නම් අපේ ප්‍රතිපාදන සීමිත වීම තුළ සමහරට UNDP වගේ ආයතන රාජ්‍ය නොවන සංවිධාන වලට මේ පිළිබඳ යම් සහායක් ලබා දී හැකි. ඒ වගේම නව තාක්ෂණය මේ පිළිබඳ මේ සඳහා යොදා ගන්න පිළිබඳව අපි නැවතත් අවධානය යොමු කරන්න ඕන. ඒ වගේම විශේෂයෙන් මේ සියලුම දේ වැදගත්කම වෙන්නේ දැනුවත් කිරීම. සියලුම රජයේ ආයතන ඒ වගේ ඉහළ මට්ටමේ සිට පහළ මට්ටම දක්වා මහජනතාවත් මේකෙන් ගන්න පුළුවන් ප්‍රයෝජන මොනවද? ඒ වගේ මේක නිවැරදිව ලබා ගන්න කෙසේද කියන එක පිළිබඳ දැනුවත් කිරීම තමයි තාමත් වැදගත් වෙන්නේ.
But I'll try to make it very brief. I think we are looking at going back to the drawing board, right? Going back to the drawing board where we need to start afresh, rejuvenate ourselves, and then come back on the basic steps that we need to do now to take this forward, right? Because we have seen the nodal ministry, as I said, starting it off, but then we have lost it. And I think now we need to take it to the next level, which means we need to go back to drawing board as stakeholders, right? And ensure that we identify the stages, a strategy has to come into play, work together in regard to ensure how do we get RTI working, because RTI also has to work. There are areas but then along with that, how do we also make proactive disclosure going? Else, we're going to see another situation where the country is today in a few years' time again, right? I guess this is now do or die situation, right? We need to get this right so that we can actually eliminate corruption and make sure that we're going on the right track. Otherwise, I'm sure in another 10 years' time or 5 years' time, we're going to sit here and talk the same topic, right? So I think this is the time that we need to put our heads together, go to the drawing board, come out with a plan and a strategy, and to make this right this time that would sustain, right? I think sustaining is the more important piece. It should not end out in a one person's tenure. It should actually continue. So the procedures, institutionalization, all these pieces has to come into play for us to get this working. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumar. I think we had a very fruitful discussion. There are resource challenges, but I guess certain documents are readily available. We hope that the ministries would make the readily available information accessible. For example, things like clearances from the agencies. For example, if you got an environment clearance, there is a document readily available. Maybe it's in English, maybe it's in Sinhala, maybe it's in Tamil. But right now, we don't see that being scanned and uploaded. And procurement contracts, we awarded a procurement contract. That document is readily available. So maybe we can start with the ones that require the least resources. It's a matter of just uploading the document onto the website. I think that will take us a long way from where we are. So I would like to thank the panel for their active contribution. Thank you very much for participation, and the audience for their active participation and the patience. And I would like Nishana to invite for her to give the closing remarks.
Subhashini, I will try my best to be extremely brief. I know everyone has been quite patient. And I want to, first of all, very much thank our esteemed panelists for their remarkable contribution and for the extremely lively and fruitful discussion from the participants as well. Special thank you, of course, to the Additional Secretary of the Ministry of Mass Media for their support, and of course the Right to Information Commission, who, although could not be here because of prior commitments, I think they're during provincial appeal sessions, they have provided invaluable feedback. I would also like to thank the top 10 ministry representatives in their 2022 assessment. So I'm just going to read out the ministries because I do think that congratulations is definitely required because they have improved since the last time we did the assessment in 2017. So we do have here the Ministry of Mass Media, Ministry of Women and Child Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Ports, Ministry of Public Administration, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Plantation, Ministry of Labor, and Ministry of Transport. So congratulations. And of course, we look forward to seeing the improvement next year as well. Thank you, of course, to the team at Verity Research who put together this event. Thank you to the event productions, our translator services, and of course to Move and Pick as well. And I want to thank all of you again for your extremely active participation. And to the panelists, thank you for your time and for your expertise. I want to let everyone know that the report, both the proactive disclosure report, the 2022 assessment, the 2017 assessment that Shannon discussed, is actually the QR code is just outside the door. There's also the Infrastructure Watch report, which is on another QR code, which I think our team can point you out to. And please do join us for refreshments, which is outside. So thank you very much, everyone.